Hello, everyone, and welcome back for episode 20 of MFA Writers. We are super excited to have come this far with all of you. When we started this podcast, our goal was twofold. First, to demystify MFA programs so that potential applicants could make informed decisions on whether to pursue this path. And second, to provide a platform for emerging writers who we believe deserve to be read and recognized for the amazing work they are producing. Those goals still stand, and these past 2 weeks have been extremely exciting on both fronts. We've had several of our regular listeners reach out to us with news that they were accepted into MFA programs. Diana, Cecilia, Ramon, and DeAndre, congratulations to all of you. It feels great to think that this podcast may have helped, even if just a little bit. And we were also excited to attend a reading at AWP featuring poet and former guest of the show, Brian Birdlong, who recently won Boulevard Lit Mag's 2020 Poetry Contest for Emerging Poets. Brian's reading was awesome, and one of the poems he read that night, titled Undead, was also one of the poems he read on our show, which I had the privilege to discuss with him. If you want to hear that conversation, check out episode 16 of the podcast. If you have really enjoyed a particular episode, if you've found it useful to your MFA pursuit, or if you just really loved one of the writers featured on our show, please reach out to us and let us know. You can email us at mfawriterspodcast@gmail.com, or you can find us on Twitter and Instagram. Further, if you have a couple of minutes, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts with a note about the show. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks again for everything, and enjoy the episode. MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today I'm with Jeremiah Barker, an essayist currently based in Chicago. They are a third-year student in the MA and MFA Litowitz Creative Writing Graduate Program at Northwestern University. Their work has appeared in Plowshares and Story Quarterly, and today Jeremiah is going to read an excerpt from their essay titled Bearing, which was selected by Esme Weijun Wong as the 2020 winner of Plowshares Emerging Writers Contest. Take it away, Jeremiah.
My mom wrote me a poem on October 3rd, 1997. It's an 18-line, 5-stanza poem with uneven, mostly unsuccessful end and internal rhymes. The title is Nobody Knows, which signals an epistemic failure. Nobody knows because knowledge is impossible. The truth conditions cannot be met. The justificatory gaps remain gaps. Knowledge is a net. I do not remember when she gave me this poem written in red ink on lined, college-ruled notebook paper, but I was 4 years old when she wrote it, presuming the date in the top left-hand corner really indicates date of composition. For Jeremiah is above the date. Perhaps she gave this to me just after Dad died from an accidental overdose in 2007, nearly 10 years after she wrote this poem. After his death, we put the contents of our home into a U-Haul and moved them from Bluefield, West Virginia, to my aunt's house in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. The Appalachian Mountains lift and slope from Alabama to Canada, a thick, rumpled sheet of ranges and valleys, thinning as peaks are made level and tributaries polluted. A visual wash of evergreen expanse. Here I sensed an impossible continuity, even as the signal connections of my life were losing strength. Though Mom had begun again to seek my face. Something was happening, deepening, on us, in us. Before we moved, my aunt stayed with us in Bluefield for a month. She flushed hundreds of painkillers down the toilet and held Mom through many sinister nights of drug withdrawal. If it wasn't worse, Mom's drug addiction paralleled Dad's, but his death shifted the pieces in her long, still kaleidoscope. She resolved to get better. I had quietly resented her addiction, adding paces between us so that when she came to, I could barely see her. Perhaps the poem then was a gesture toward reconciliation, suggesting that despite any perceived lapses in her love for me, it was constant. When unfolded, the paper's creases reveal 20 rectangles, but she probably gave it to me, folded, as one. The first line of Mom's poem, I pretend I'm glad it turned out this way, is a line spoken after rupture, after a turning inside out, Something spills and she rushes to contain it by pretending, but also by writing this poem. And the third line ends with an exclusion the persona intones 4 times at the end of stanzas 1, 2, 3, and 5. And I'm hurting inside, and nobody knows it but me. She underlines her isolation, for which, over the years, I've groaned rereading, accusing the persona, no, my mom, of narcissism. I've learned, though, to give her and myself our pain, as there are scarce other things on which we can lay claim, and this only partly. She underlines herself to address or redress herself and social denial, as a woman, as a mother with a son with a secret. I haven't wanted to write this story because I was worried I would reproduce the harm I wanted my writing to mitigate, at least for me. Or, I wanted my recounting to sate something in me, and I wasn't sure, am not sure it will. I want to get up inside this wound, describe the arrow's barbs without filing them down. Sometimes, though, I've not simply not wanted to think about what prompted Mom's poesis. Her poem is a reminder of what happened, and my incapacity to remember this serial event, my childhood sexual abuse, has formed me. A source of shame rather than relief, the inaccessibility of this memory had, into my 20s, burdened me, bearing down on me and leaving trails that led me nowhere safe. My sexual abuse rearranged, exhausted, fragmented my family, and that I could not remember it led me to an unsayable belief that I had lied. And, unforgivably, my lie had ruined my family. Though I do not have the memory, which is really a collection of moments, I do remember images burning my mind up while sitting in the lukewarm water in the large bathtub in my parents' spacious bathroom. I wanted to say something, but didn't know how. The speech was lodged in my body. How can a locution be too mature to exist outside my body, too unthinkable to leave me? Why didn't I listen when he had something to say? The third stanza begins.
Jeremiah, thanks so much for reading that. Thanks for being here. I'm excited to talk to you.
Thank you for having me. It's really exciting.
Well, I've talked with guests on this show before about writing as a form of therapy and writing as a way to work through past traumas. This story is about trauma and trying to understand it, even if you don't fully remember it. And you wrote in this piece, I haven't wanted to write this story because I was worried I would reproduce the harm I wanted my writing to mitigate, at least for me, or I wanted my recounting to sate something in me, and I wasn't sure, am not sure it will. I want to get up inside this wound, describe the arrow's barbs without filing them down. First off, very beautiful. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about that idea and what made you decide in the end to write this piece and maybe what you've learned from it.
Oh, those are some good questions. Quite compacted, at least in my mind. It was an essay that I wanted to write for a long time, but given the content of it, felt a little bit untouchable to me. But I think that after having written an essay about both of my parents' deaths, it was the essay that needed to be written next. So if you allow me to tell you the process for a moment, I think what had happened is that after I wrote that first essay, titled Laundry, which was published in Story Quarterly, this might sound a little bit too artsy, but what I ended up doing was I took the margins of that essay and cut them out into little slips of paper, and then I knew that in order for me to write the essay bearing, I had to do it in small clips, not in like the sort of small squares that sort of made the note that my mother gave me with the poem on it. And so I would just write on these slips, try to write as many of them in one day. And then after I had written a stack of them, I would put them on the computer and then try to revise it that way. So it was a way for me to sort of keep open the relationship between the first essay and the second one, because I see those different kinds of traumas linked together. So I think in terms of why I didn't want to write this, because I was worried about not mitigating the harm, I think that what I wanted to do is keep the idea that I wanted to keep trauma tractable, not something that's lodged in someone that becomes just this thing that they keep running into, the solidity of it, that would just hurt them again and again. And there's also something about when you inscribe something, you put it on paper, that becomes more sure or more certain. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to keep the ambivalence there.
Like you said, trauma in general it's difficult to talk or write about, but even more so when it involves family, or even more so, I imagine, when it might be published for anyone to read. So what advice do you have for anyone who may be at that starting point, that point where they're debating whether to write about it or not? What would you say to them about like facing some of those same fears that you were facing?
I think I would want the person to give themselves what they needed to be okay. And if they weren't ready to write those traumas down, to not feel bad about feeling incapacitated to write them down. I know that one of the things that we wanted to talk about was whether or not writing can be understood as a form of therapy. And my impulse is to say that it's not, at least for me. I think it often can be, especially when it comes to journaling. But when I want to create an essay, to create a piece of art, there's such an artifice around the thing made that it feels somewhat separate from who I am as a person. So I think I see it slightly differently from the often self-soothing manifestation of therapy. But then again, this might depend on what you consider therapy. I think one thing that I want to do in therapy, as someone who is in it as well, is to figure out a way to rotate a problem. And I think that writing essays also does that for me. So there's also a way in which it mirrors the sort of processing work that I do in therapy as well, although I see it as separate due to the artifice of making it.
Well, it sounds like what I'm hearing is that the transition from a piece of writing being private to potentially being published, or shared with a workshop can change what it does for you as far as like helping you through trauma. Like when you're journaling, you know it's just going to be for yourself. Do you find that knowing other people are going to read it changes how you approach that piece of writing?
I would say no. I suppose I'm one of those people, and I hesitate to say this. I want to keep it ambivalent when I say this as well, but I think for the most part, I write for myself. I write in order to think. And insofar as I can detach myself from imagining or fantasizing an audience, and thereby torquing what I say due to the people that I'm addressing, I tend to not do that. So maybe it's I begin to essay from a place of uneasiness within myself. This sort of internal distances, I want to look at those, inhabit those, and attempt to write those down without being too pressurized by an imagined audience who expects something of me, expects a certain way of writing about trauma.
Is that something that you've always felt and like has come pretty naturally to you, that kind of being able to separate yourself from like a perceived audience in your writing? Or is that something that you've had to work on as you've progressed as a writer?
I think I came into writing very late, only within the past 5 years. It was just a couple years after my mom died, and I think that sort of provoked me into the writing space because there was such a charge to that, of course, and such an uncertainty and a curiosity around what happened that I wanted to, just dilate on those problems that for myself. So I think, maybe in terms of writing personal essays, I do think that I sort of began that way. Although, of course, I do feel the impetus sometimes to imagine an audience, to want to impress them, even I want to make art, and I'm not just making it for myself, though primarily so.
It's a fine line, right? And it's a difficult line to walk, I find, because I find that some of my best writing is when I'm not worried about like whether it's going to get published or whether it's going to get praised in workshop, but instead, if I'm just writing something that really resonates with me, something that naturally has some energy to it based on like my experience. But being in the workshop environment where people are going to read, praise, critique your work, I mean, it can have an effect on you, I think, if you're not careful. Is that something you've experienced?
Certainly. Although I think it's a bit of subterfuge on my part. I think I go in believing that the thing that I've written is not me. It's not a total inscription of me, but in the workshop setting, when someone sort of volleys a critique that feels like a personal attack, even though they're merely looking at the text, it does feel like they are interrogating your own aesthetic judgments and thereby yourself. But so I guess it just takes some reminding.
Yeah. I think we all need that, like that little voice in our head that just pats us on the back every now and then and tells us it's okay, just keep going, keep doing what you're doing. As you talk about in this essay, you're originally from Appalachia, and you told me before the interview that being from there and being a queer and gay person have given you ways to orientate, process, metabolize, and critique. When people talk about fiction, they often say we, should write what we know. But when it comes to nonfiction, how important is it, do you think, to utilize your backgrounds and your identities to formulate a unique point of view or lens for your writing?
I wonder if there would be any other way. Can we not? I think so. I do think that some people distance themselves from their backgrounds and identities, sometimes to protect themselves for good reason. I think I want to keep. I want to again, like, sort of inhabit this in between space between identity and non-identity, personality and impersonality. I think most of the time I do write from a place of sort of impersonality, even though I'm most of what I write are personal essays about my childhood in Appalachia and my parents and my relationships with other people. So I think that I don't want to moralize, or I sort of want to bracket my judgment for those who do not wish to describe or inscribe their backgrounds and their identities onto what they write. Though I think that inevitably that will happen. I think what I want to see in a writing, in a piece of work, is someone's sensibility, someone's vivid sensibility. And I think that with practice and with some self-reflexivity, your sensibility can't help but show up on the page.
Maybe it's more a question of voice then, like finding your voice as a writer, and how much do you think background and identities plays into like finding that way that only you can tell a story, which I think is one of the things that we should be trying to do in an MFA program, is really figuring out how best each of us can tell our own stories. Is that something that has evolved for you, that voice and that lens? Or is that something, you said that you have only been writing really for 5 years. Is that something that was there from the very beginning, or something you've been working on?
I've been working on it. I think that I am incomplete, and my thoughts are incomplete, obviously. And I think that the identities and backgrounds are always shifting. They're in flux. There's a sort of flickering there. And I think insofar as I can write into that flicker, that's what I want to do. Identity has a tendency to, when we talk about it, have a sort of fixedness. Not always, but I think it is important for a lot of people, especially people from marginalized backgrounds. Showcasing your identity or writing into it is vital, because we live in a society, in a social structure that already has preconceived notions about what that identity entails. So to write against that, to offer counterpoints or countermands to our received representations of that is essential. Though I do think that as someone really interested in queer theory, I want to explore the eddying sort of sense of identity that is has a sort of groundlessness to it.
Well, I love the way you put that, because the way that we talk about identity is almost like it's this fixed thing, but that idea of it flickering and writing into that flicker, I feel almost like we're talking kind of around a similar thing. Like when we say writing as a form of therapy, I mean, I guess in a way, writing into that flicker and trying to like come to terms with this kind of ebb and flow of who you are as a human being is some kind of like, can be some kind of therapy, right? Maybe the term therapy is too concrete for what we're talking about, but trying to figure out who we are at any given moment is important, and that's in a way what therapy can provide, right?
Yeah, I agree. And like I mentioned earlier, I consider writing as a space for me to think. And I think that therapy is also a space in which we can think. I think nowadays, with our diminished sociality and the way that technology mediates so much of our thought world, we want to distract ourselves. We want to bore ourselves from the intensities. We're not given too many spaces, quote unquote, under capitalism to think. And art making is a place where we can do that.
And I wonder if it's, needed even more now in this present moment with the pandemic, because I don't know about you, but I have found myself over the past year looking for every opportunity to shut my brain off and not think and be bored and zone out and watch trash TV or something, so that I don't have to reckon with what's happening around me and how out of my control it feels. But I completely agree that every time that I sit down and start writing, I'm amazed by the thoughts that I have on the page that I can't form just thinking about a subject. And so do you find that, like, when you're writing, you are often surprised by what comes out, and can that then be a seed for a piece for you when you're writing?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, I think the accidents and surprises are what sort of give writing a lot of momentum. And we can only ever sort of get there when we put words to the page. I want to back up and say that I am by no means a patron saint of the sort of like strong willfulness to like get oneself to write in this moment. I think that most often I'm sitting at my desk, looking out my window, watching the snow, trying to figure out why I always feel gray inside. And so I haven't been doing a lot of writing, but I'm curious about your thoughts on, too, when you do write, what kind of writing style you find yourself gravitating towards? What kind of writing you think that you can do? For example, myself, reflection comes hard to me right now. I feel like I can't think in large part. And the only kind of writing that I can do when I can get myself to do it is description. And I think description obtains its own version of thinking and interpretation, but it's different than, as I said before, like sort of rotating a problem and sort of pulling back and abstracting it.
Well, I will say I've never in my life had an issue with writer's block. I've always thought like writer's block, I'm like, it must be just an excuse to not write. I mean, like, that's what revision's for. In this moment, during the pandemic, I found for the first time that it's like my brain is not turning problems over, as you say, in the same way that it was before. It's like, it's almost like that muscle is just so fatigued right now that I'm having trouble with that. And I wonder if that's a phenomenon that's happening everywhere right now. It heartens me a little bit that you say that you're also having similar issues.
Maybe. I on Twitter, at least, which I tend to avoid. I don't even have an account. But I peak occasionally. It would seem that so many people are being extremely productive, that COVID has given them a space in which to think profusely, but that is not my situation. And one of my soapboxes around this, I think, is that maybe an acknowledgement of the difficulty of thinking when you are single and queer, and a lot of the socialities that you depended on to sort of buffer all this internal work are no longer available to you. Whereas when you are already integrated into a family, or you have a partner, there's a dependency there that could shore you up, that can give you a lot of care support. So I have been attempting throughout this whole pandemic, or our ongoing crisis, to have compassion for myself when I can't write due to depression or anxiety, which those fade into each other.
Yeah, and I think that can be tricky, like when you're in an MFA program, because you have certain deadlines you have to meet. You have to turn in a piece on this date to workshop next week. So then you feel like that pressure to write through the anxiety or depression or anything that might be stopping you from doing your best work in that moment. We're going to talk a little bit about this later, but what do you personally do in those moments if you're facing that anxiety, facing that depression, and you don't want to write through it, but you feel like you have to? Like, what do you do in those moments? Is there a way that you work through that and keep going, or do you just give yourself the grace to walk away from it, maybe read instead?
Both.
Yeah.
I do a lot of reading when I cannot sort of mobilize or utilize that sort of apparatus in me that puts words onto the page. And there's something more relaxed, more soft about reading that is achievable and accessible. But when I'm forced to, and I have to, when there's a deadline, I try to show up for my writing, like create a schedule, and insofar as I can meet that schedule, make that appointment, so to speak. That's what I try to do. Like, I have an appointment set in my phone from 3 to 4, only an hour. That's doable. I don't want to, but I go to the desk at that time, and I sometimes look at the blank page and I don't write anything. But I sat there for an hour, and I do it the next day if I can. And eventually some words get written down. Sometimes not many words, but some words. And they're not always artful. Usually they're not. But I've been trying to give myself permission lately to also write crap, which is most of what sort of constitutes a first draft for me anyway.
Well, my partner, Hannah, always tells me the first drafts don't have to be perfect. They just have to be written. So I'm trying to give myself some grace on that front as well. But let's go back to bearing a little bit, because I read this essay in its entirety, and honestly, it's breathtaking. Really, it's really, really fantastic. And I encourage all listeners to try to get their hands on a copy of the winter 2020-2021 issue of Plowshares and read the whole thing. We'll put that link on our website. But I mean, the subject matter, of course, is moving, but the writing, the sentence level writing, is really something to behold. And so I'm curious, we talked about writing in starts and stops, or writing through anxiety or depression. When you were writing this essay, did you run into that? Was this something that you wrote, like you started it and the floodgates opened and it all came out? Or was this something that you worked on in starts and stops?
Well, first, thank you for your kindness and your remarks. That's one of the pleasures of publishing, despite the sort of anxieties being attached to it, is that so many people are generous and kind. This was the first piece of which it was available online, so I heard from a lot of friends. And there's a special delight in sort of talking through the art that you made with another person that cares about you. So I appreciate that. This one is actually a floodgate example. Like I mentioned before, I had these little slips of paper, and only writing on a tiny little slip was so easy. It was, I just had this little slip, and that's all I have to do is put a couple sentences on that, flip that over, maybe put it somewhere else, and then I'll write on the next slip. And eventually the slips just kept coming. And I think not seeing a huge sheet of paper of chaotic blank space was helpful to write this. And I also had put off writing it for so long that I had so much time to gestate and enter into reverie and to talk with other people about what happened, that I felt very ready to write it. So much of the piece, as you've seen, leans on or is dependent on conversations with my grandmother, whom I call Nanny. So I had these notebooks of a lot of her quotes and phrases that she would use and anecdotes. Certainly not all of them showed up in the piece, but also having that to depend on when I felt sort of quote unquote blocked or sort of too congested emotionally, I would look at the notebooks and look at a phrase and try to write with that.
Well, like I said, this, like the sentence level writing is so beautiful that as I was reading, I was thinking there must have been a lot of revision that was done here. But maybe not. Maybe you're talented at like on another level than I am. But I do want to know what your revision process was like for this piece and just in general, what that usually looks like for you.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, there certainly was revision. Quite a bit of it. I tend to be quite generous when it comes to revision. I will scrap whole paragraphs, whole pages. I even delight in it because I'm so self-deprecating. I'm like, this paragraph is absolutely horrendous and I cannot wait to get rid of it. So my revision process looks different for every essay, just as how I approach it or how I encounter it is different. I would say that for Bearing, at least, what I ended up doing was writing it all out and then printing it out and then cutting out each paragraph and then putting them all on my floor and rearranging them to make sure that there was a flow, that the sort of braidedness would show up, that there are moments in the text where I sort of thread through lines of that poem. And I wanted to make sure that those were relating to the preceding and the following paragraphs in a way that had a sort of lift to them. And that certainly did not even show up in the first draft. I didn't have those lines threaded through at all. That came later. And actually that came with, by way of a conversation with a person in my cohort. She suggested that, and it was a really brilliant suggestion, and it really worked. And it also sort of showcased that intergenerational aspect of that piece, and the way that all three of us that I talk about in the essay who were traumatized by this man were differently submerged in that trauma, though there were reverberations. And my mom's sort of lyric abstraction allowed me to, sort of bind the three of us in a way.
Yeah, I talk to so many people who say that they don't even like print their work out when they're reading it or revising it. And then I love talking to people who do print it out because I think it's important, but also like getting down on the floor, rearranging things, cutting up. Like, I mean, it's a very old school style of revision, I think, but there's something that the brain does differently when it's looking at the words in that form, don't you think? That instead of like still on the screen where you type them?
Yeah, I agree. And it's very physical. And the piece itself is very physical. It's about embodiment. And the piece of paper of my mom's poem as being something that I could hold, and it has wrinkles on it. The physicality of it is present there. The folds of it are so deep because I've been unfolded it and folded it back so many times. And I think that sort of miming that was a way for me to see my mom's situation as really similar to mine, as both of us are thinking about what happened and attempting to make something of it, to not make something of it, but to, I think, see it as as something that could be aerated, that's something that doesn't have to be forever sort of approached with anxiety or agony.
Well, I'm curious to find out how your writing process and revision process has changed, if at all, since joining the MFA program. So let's shift a little and bring the Litowitz graduate program at Northwestern University into the conversation. The program is actually a dual MA and MFA program in creative writing and English. The program takes 3 years to complete, and then students leave with both degrees, which is quite unique. Was there anything in particular that drew you to this program as opposed to kind of a typical MFA only program?
Yes, two things. One is Litowitz, who is my advisor. One thing that I suggest to prospective students or people who are thinking about getting an MFA is, one, location, and two, maybe who are your favorite writers and where do they teach? I think it's what a lot of people do, right? And if you can get accepted there, that's great. And so that was one reason why I wanted to enter that program. And the other one is that I have always used the provisionality of theory to supplement or rearrange or rearticulate my creative writing. And so I was really drawn to this program because you can sort of toggle between or sort of lay yourself upon the threshold of both theory land and like creative writing land. And I don't think those things are dichotomous entirely. I think that a lot of creative writing is a translation of that criticism and theory. But I wanted, as someone who is particularly moved by a lot of more academic writing, I wanted to be able to let that be a sort of scaffolding for a lot of my creative work.
So in the program, are you taking these critical classes and then taking the creative writing classes and they're like completely separate, or is the program doing something or providing some kind of way in which you can connect to those things in the classroom in your writing? Like, are you bringing that critical stuff into the creative writing classes, or are you kind of being asked to make those connections on your own?
We can bring the critical writing into the creative classroom. But because all of us are taking different literary seminars, it would be sort of ungenerous for us to sort of, let me tell you a little bit about Derrida and why this sort of relates to, this essay that I'm writing. If someone had not also taken that seminar, you would have to do a lot of legwork to make that relevant. But within the literary seminars, at least literature seminars, it depends on the professor, but often you can submit a creative piece at the end as your final project if it also engages with the material that was discussed throughout the quarter. So a little bit of a blending, it is possible, although they are considered distinct. For example, most of the literature seminars that I took, I wanted to produce a academic paper at the end of it because it's a different register in which I can think about a problem. And so when I'm going to move into the more creative space, I can use that register, and they do different things.
And so you said that they're kind of separate entities. So does that mean that the faculty who are teaching like the critical classes are not the same people who are going to be teaching the creative classes, or do some of those professors teach both of those in both of those areas?
I think they're starting to teach across the two separate disciplines, though most of them have their own, they're situated within their own programs, the graduate program for the PhDers and the graduate program for the MFAers. But for example, and I didn't take this course, but one of the graduate professors for the PhD program or for the undergraduate program is teaching a publishing workshop because she's also published a lot of public-facing academic work. Not strictly academic, but, in the New Yorker or something. And so that could be really helpful for a creative writer as well. Like, how do you write a pitch?
Yeah, I guess, if the faculty, like you said, is sometimes crossing over, does that open up opportunities to work more closely with faculty members on, let's say, a creative piece that's pulling from critical things that you learned in another class? Like, do you get the chance to like have those conversations with the faculty one-on-one about what you're trying to do in either the critical piece or the creative piece, and how they may or may not cross over?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's one of the strengths of the program, I think, is that, and again, I don't want to keep those two things separate, because I think you can have creativity within criticism, and you can have criticism within the more creative space. But yeah, there are so many opportunities to make an office appointment with a professor and sit down with a poem and describe the way in which that poem is enacting some of the thinking with the theory or criticism that we were all engaging with in the class.
Well, students in the program, according to the website, complete a capstone essay by the end of their second year and spend their third year mostly working on a book-length creative thesis of their own design. So my first reaction is, it sounds like a lot of work. And I'm curious how you've balanced the critical work in the program alongside the creative work that you're also expected to do.
That's a great question. And I think that's one thing that if anybody's interested in applying to the program should know, is that I found it really difficult to manage both all of that all of the output that is expected of you, both within the creative writing workshop and in the literature seminars. The seminars tend to require a lot of reading, hours upon hours upon hours of reading classics, reading theory, and in order to do well in those classes, and to feel like a participant in the room, it does require actually putting in a lot of those hours. And I think that I had a tendency to not write because I had been spending too much time reading. And I think that's one thing that I regret, having sort of privileged the theory thinking over my translation of that into my essaying.
So you said that you struggled with that a little bit. I'm curious if the school has some kind of support system in place for like helping students balance those things, because it does sound like a lot.
The one thing is that I think that, as I mentioned before, some literature professors will give you the option to submit a creative piece at the end of that seminar. And so that does free you up a bit. And it does induce you to think about the way in which you can make art alongside of the criticism. And I think another thing that maybe helps with that is both the shared experience with other people in the cohort of sort of negotiating this space, holding each other accountable, talking with each other about the problems of doing so. But I don't think that there is I don't know what it would look like to create like some kind of workshop or program or some kind of programming that would help not overburden ourselves. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's hard. One of my friends says, you could sleep when you're dead. And so just like do all the work now and enjoy it as best as you can.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's particularly good advice, but
well, but you said that like at times you were putting aside the creative writing in favor of doing this critical work because that felt more immediate. But I think that's in my opinion, in my experience, that can be dangerous for me because I need the space, the mental space. I need to be bored a little bit to really get the creative juices flowing. And if I'm just back-to-back scheduled everything out, sometimes I find it hard to turn that on when I sit down to write a story. So it's a tricky thing. I don't know if it's teachable. I don't know what it would look like either, but it's interesting. And, you mentioned accountability. You had told me before the interview that was one thing that you think about a lot, holding oneself accountable, but also depending on others to provoke you to think more robustly and consistently. So have you found in the program, you've been able to build those relationships with whether it's faculty or people in your cohort that provide that provocation of thought that you mentioned there?
Yeah, both faculty and certain members of my cohort. I think that I tend to flourish on one-on-one conversations. Workshop settings are difficult for me because I think that everyone in the room is projecting a lot of anxieties. And although extremely generous and really helpful, as they often are, I think I want to slow down. I prefer a sort of slower space where there's less of a sort of injunction to say something smart about someone's piece. If you get close with someone, it becomes a moment of care. I think that they've really looked at what you've written. They know who you are, and when they offer a critique or offer a site of expansion, you trust that more. And so, yeah, I think I try to link up with a couple people who I can schedule one-on-one Zooms with.
It makes it a little bit harder now with the not being able to be in person, but having those people to reach out to, even if it is just on Zoom, I agree is important. Well, the program, I mean, it's a pretty prestigious program. It's selective. It's hard to get into. The funding is about as high as you're going to find in an MFA program. And I imagine that leads to certain expectations coming into a program like this. And so I'm curious how the program and just the MFA experience in general has either lived up to those expectations or fallen short of those expectations.
You're right about funding, which helps a lot. And you have health insurance, which is vital, especially, we've talked about depression this whole episode, having, access to health insurance so that you also have access to mental health resources has been so key for me. So I think I'm really grateful for that. In terms of expectations, I think for the most part they have been met. Although there are disappointments and there have been glitches because my cohort was the inaugural cohort. We're the very first. I think that a lot of the planning and the structure of the program was it was very well. It was thought out, but it wasn't. There's no way to know how it will go until you actually put people in that program and move them through the system of it. And so I think that there were moments in which all of us were disappointed or unsure how to advocate for ourselves for something that would be more workable. So this has been an ongoing problem, and I think that now that we're about to admit the fourth cohort, I think that things have gotten much smoother due to our advocacy, my cohort and the ones that have followed me. So expectations have been met. I mean, we knew coming in that we'd have a certain number of workshops that would be sort of cross-genre or specific to our genres. And I think all of us knew too that it would be difficult to toggle between the MA work and the MFA work. But maybe unexpected was the degree to which that was difficult to achieve.
Well, you mentioned the advocacy that you all have done. What has that looked like? Because, I mean, that's something that I think is important for any listeners to know entering their own MFA program is how they can better advocate for themselves. So what has that looked like for you and your cohort and the ones who've come after you?
For us, it looked like sending a lot of emails, sort of getting together and creating Word documents, having conversations between ourselves, what is working, what's not working, how can we collate these problems, and then send them off to the director of graduate studies and the director of the creative writing program. In our second or third quarter, I can't remember which, at the beginning of our first year, or maybe, it's so hard to remember now. What is time?
Yeah.
We had a large meeting that was a little bit intense, actually, with the faculty of the program, telling them, we were having a really hard time actually trying to write when there's such a pressure to also do all this reading and to engage in all this criticism. There seems to be a privileging of one over the other, and how do we create more workshop spaces? So that was one way, is to try to find a way to get people in the room and create a space to have a dialogue about what is and what isn't working. Also finding the people within the program finding the faculty within the program who are amenable to change, and sort of delegating a lot of the advocacy work to them can often be quite effective as well.
So, I mean, I don't know how you would find the time to do anything outside of all of this reading and writing that you're doing, but there are some cool events and organizations connected with the Northwestern program, including a visiting writer series, and Tri-Quarterly magazine is published there. And, you know, the school's in Chicago, so I'm sure there are all sorts of literary events that are available. Have there been any events or organizations that you've gotten involved in that you've enjoyed during your time there in the program?
I have, yeah. Especially at the beginning of the program, I was just so excited, and I attended too many symposiums. This is probably another reason why I wasn't doing a lot of creative writing, is that I was very caught up in just wanting to overexpose myself to all of the culture, all of the literariness of it all. So I would go to events at DePaul. I would go to events at UChicago. They had a lecture series by Ann Carson there that was truly magical. There's also an organization in town called Story Studio, I think run by Rebecca Mackay, if that's how you pronounce her last name. And they offer, especially for people, non-MFAers, who are just part of the working community, a place to workshop their work. Though graduate students can also go in and take their workshops. There's the Block Museum that is attached to Northwestern. So there are galleries, innumerable galleries here in Chicago. So sort of being linked up with all of these creative entities can also be a wonderful go to your writing. You feel stuck, you go to a gallery, you do a little bit of ekphrastic work, and you feel finally that you can actually write something, for example.
I love that. I love that idea. That's one of the things I miss the most with, this past year, is not being able, I'm here in Kansas City, not being able to walk 2 blocks to the Nelson Atkins Museum and wander around. I really miss that. Well, this has been fantastic. But before we go, I want to give you the last word. If there's anything that you want to add that you think we missed, or just any other advice that you have for anyone considering Northwestern or just an MFA program in general.
I don't have too much to add. I think we hit on a lot of things. Maybe I would just say something that a lot of people say when it comes to considering an MFA, which is, it depends on how moneyed you are, obviously, but as someone who doesn't have many coins in his pocket, I would say that if you're not going to get funding to do the MFA, maybe consider not doing it. I strongly consider you're not doing it. The other thing I would say is just that we've talked about depression a lot, and maybe I would just want to highlight the importance of friendship and the gift of having a writing community. And I think that one of the advantages of being in an MFA is connecting up with people who care deeply about the gift of literature. And it's truly a gift into itself for me to engage in that.
Yeah, well, I have absolutely enjoyed connecting with you, and I'm so glad that you took the time out of your busy schedule to chat with me for a bit. So thank you so much.
Of course, it's my pleasure.